In this video, we examine labor markets under conditions of perfect competition versus the employer having monopoly power. That's the situation that we refer to as monopsony, and this will show the argument, the case for the presence of labor unions. Okay, if a labor market is perfectly competitive, the wage paid to workers is set in the market. Here's the demand and the supply for labor. The name of the payment to labor is the wage rate. And let's say the equilibrium wage rate is $10. Then an individual firm, say an individual McDonald's store, perceives the supply curve of labor to be perfectly wage elastic at the going wage rate. In other words, this store can hire as many or as few workers as it wants to at the going wage rate of $10. Now the demand for labor is downward sloping. The demand curve for labor, which is a derived demand curve, shows how much extra workers are worth to the firm. And diminishing returns to labor causes the demand curve to be downward sloping. Extra workers contribute less extra output, so what they're worth to the firm in terms of generated revenues diminishes. And the profit maximizing firm will hire all workers whose contribution to revenues is above the cost of having those workers around, the wage rate. So sort of using that same Bob Barker approach, L star is the profit optimal number of workers. And note that the payment to the workers equals what they're worth to the firm at the margin. Now in the case of monopsony, and the example I'll use is the Georgia Boot in North Georgia. This is the only firm where folks have an option of working off the farm. And in this case, Georgia Boot has monopoly power in the hiring side of the labor market. Okay? In this case, Georgia Boot perceives the market labor supply curve as being the relevant supply curve. And it shows that if Georgia Boot wants to hire additional workers, it has to pay a higher wage. For example, if you want 5 workers, you can hire 5 workers, according to the supply curve, for $10 a piece. If you want to hire 6 workers, the supply curve indicates that you need to pay a wage of $11. We assume the law of one wage. Everybody pays the same wage. So the wage bill will go up for 2 reasons. The 6th worker has to be paid $11, but on top of that, the upward sloping supply curve requires that you pay these workers $11 as well, whereas you used to pay them $10 a piece. So the increase in the wage bill, or it's called the marginal factor cost, is greater than the wage. It's equal to the payment to the last worker plus the additional monies paid to get the wage up to $11. And in this case, that's the $11 paid the 6th worker plus an extra $1 to the 5 workers who used to work for $10. So that's a total of $16. The wage bill goes up from $50 to $66. The marginal factor cost is above the wage by the amount of the extra payment to get the wage up to the level required to attract additional workers. Okay, now the demand curve for labor, which shows how much an additional worker is worth to the firm. It's also referred to as the marginal revenue product schedule. In other words, if you hire a 5th worker and that worker allows you to make 10 more pair of boots, and if you can sell those boots for $10 a piece, then that worker would be worth $100, and that's the maximum you'd be willing to pay the worker. Additional workers would become worth less, not because you're selling the shoes for less, but because each worker's marginal product would be declining. So, do the Bob Barker. Georgia Boot would hire all workers whose marginal revenue product is above the marginal factor cost. This is the profit optimal number of workers for the monopsonist to hire. Now, this is what the worker is worth to Georgia Boot. Let's say $50. And then Georgia Boot, the supply curve tells Georgia Boot how much you must pay in order to attract this many workers. So the worker, let's say, gets paid $20. So this is the source of exploitation of monopsony. The worker at the margin is worth more than what the worker is paid. That exploitation sets the stage for there to be labor unions. If this were a perfectly competitive market, then supply and demand would result in us having this L subscript C, that stands for perfect competition. That would be the number of workers, and they would receive, let's say, $30. And note that the $30, what they're paid, equals what they're worth to the firm at the margin. So if a labor union comes in, the strategy that they might employ would be to, for the workers who the monopsonist currently hires, these workers, they could strive to get the highest payment possible for those workers. And if the labor union were totally successful, the wage rate could go from $20 up to $50, what the workers are worth to the firm. So that would be one outcome of monopoly. One outcome of a labor union addressing this monopsonist situation. And then the other extreme would be the labor union says, we want to get as many jobs in this area as possible. And the most jobs that could be generated would be the perfectly competitive outcome. And actually, anything along this section of the demand schedule represents a combination of the number of people and the wages that would be the highest wages that the monopsonist would be willing to pay to these workers. Any of these points along the red interval would represent optimal outcomes for the labor union.